Hey guys, welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, the channel where curiosity meets chronic drowsiness. Tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams, into the warm, crackling hearths and flour-dusted kitchens of the 18th century, where bread was prized, ovens were wood-fired, and sometimes, just sometimes, a croissant could kill you. Press that like button before your eyelids press themselves. Now, bread, innocent though it seems, what with its soft belly and golden crust, was once a matter of life and death. You see, in the 1700s, bread wasn't simply something you smeared with butter. It was the lifeblood of European lower classes. The baguette was not a luxury. It was your breakfast, your lunch, and occasionally, if you were particularly rebellious and terribly French, a weapon in a riot. But our story doesn't lie in the baguette's revolutionary trajectory, not yet, but instead deep inside the flour sacks themselves. Picture a dusty old mill on the edge of a sleepy English village. There's a gentle creak turning the wooden wheel, a cow watching half interestedly, and inside, the miller, shirt rolled up, humming some ancient folk tune about the misfortunes of losing both love and turnips in the same week. You might think, what a quaint and harmless image. But dear listener, here's where it gets interesting, and mildly toxic. In the 18th century, food preservation was a bit like trying to keep houseplants alive in winter, difficult, fussy, and reliant on methods that would horrify modern health inspectors. For flour, especially, the temptation to stretch its shelf life or improve its colour was too strong for some unscrupulous or woefully misguided millers and bakers to resist. Enter chalk. Yes, chalk. The same stuff you might imagine a schoolmaster snapping into bits before scrawling algebraic torment across a slate board. Ground chalk or powdered gypsum was sometimes added to flour to make it appear whiter. Because in the 1700s, white bread wasn't just a carb, it was a status symbol. To eat dark, grainy loaves was to wear the badge of the peasantry. But white bread, that was like saying, I own a fireplace in every room and only cry on Thursdays. The poor wanted to look rich, the rich wanted to look richer, and millers, clever as they were, knew an opportunity when they saw one. So the flour was whitened with chalk. Sometimes alum was tossed in too, a nice astringent compound that could tighten both your shirts and your intestines. Bakers argued that it helped make the bread rise better. Doctors argued that it helped their business rise, one stomachache at a time. Oh, and if that wasn't worrisome enough, brace yourself. Lead. Tiny amounts of lead might also find their way into flour through improperly cleaned millstones or contaminated water supplies. But even more terrifying, or frankly impressive, in a morbid, humans are wild kind of way, some artificers intentionally added London white. A delightful euphemism for lead carbonate, to flour products to create the whitest, fluffiest loaves possible. Imagine biting into a lovely slice of fresh bread, warm from the oven, only to unknowingly acquire a dose of neurotoxicity. Nutty, with a hint of hallucination. By the 1750s, the British government, spotting a mild trend of people collapsing face first into their dinner rolls, eventually began cracking down on food adulteration. But enforcement, like most 18th century policies, was a tad spotty. Kind of like sending a sleepy beagle to guard the crown jewels. In London, the bread assize, a medieval law first drafted centuries before, had attempted to regulate the weight and price of bread, and by extension, its ingredients. But for every honest baker weighing his loaves with care, there was another slipping in questionable powders and praying no inspectors showed up before Saturday. Now, before you lose sleep over poisoned pastries, remember, not everybody was dropping like flies after eating a muffin in Georgian England. Many people lived long and crumb-filled lives, their bodies perhaps hardened by time, ale, and a diet consisting mainly of things that grew in pubs or cellars. Still, the fear lingered. Was your brain fog from heartbreak or bad bread? And if your aunt started twitching at tea, was it nerves or the scones? As the candlelight flickers in our imaginary 18th century bakery, the mill wheel creaks slowly through the sleepy silence. The flour dances in the golden air, innocent as snow, and just a bit cursed. Now close your eyes. We're only just beginning to explore the soft, strange saga of history's most deceptively dangerous meal. Let the warm aroma of fiction and fact tuck you in gently as we drift toward the next deliciously suspicious bite. Chapter 2. The Curious Crust of the 18th Century. Let us drift back, my dear snoozy scholar, to a time when the aroma of fresh bread was both a comfort and a cautionary tale. Imagine the streets of 18th century London or Paris just before dawn. The cobblestones are damp with mist, and somewhere down a narrow alley a baker stokes a brick oven. Flames flicker like candlelight shadows, and dough, still innocent, still hopeful, prepares for its baptism by fire. The scent wafts warmly through the narrow lanes, curling around wrought iron fences, slipping beneath wooden shutters, and stirring dreams of breakfast. But alas, not all loaves are created equal, for in this golden age of enlightenment and powdered wigs, bread became not only the staff of life, but occasionally the agent of its betrayal. You see, the 1700s were a deliciously dangerous time for bread lovers because wheat was both in demand and quite often in dismayingly short supply. And when scarcity arrives at the table, so too does the exotic art of food fraud. Bakers, pressed by economic hardship, wartime shortages, and the unrelenting demand for a fluffy, white loaf, began to work culinary miracles that would make even the bravest digestive tract tremble. Let us now consider the peculiar obsession with white bread. In the bougie parlours of the well-to-do, the whiter the crumb, the finer the guest. Brown bread, peasant fare, something to be fed to livestock, or, in moments of dire economic humility, to one's own cousins. So clever minds sought to replicate the snowy bread of the wealthy using, shall we say, non-traditional methods. Among the tricks of the trade was the infamous addition of chalk, crushed, powdered, utterly charmless chalk. It lightened the flour, gave it that noble pallor, and added, one suspects, a certain minerality to the bite. Alum, a chemical compound typically more welcome in a chemistry lab than on a dinner plate, also made regular appearances in bread. Rather ironically, alum was a firming agent, both for pickles and, disturbingly, for human bowels. Bread made with alum was celebrated for its resilience, its perky loft, and its odd tendency to discourage digestive enthusiasm for days on end. The crust that emerged from these dubious experiments was sometimes bright, sometimes brittle, and occasionally capable of igniting mild gastrointestinal drama. But worst of all was the hidden addition of what was euphemistically called whitening powder. Sometimes this meant ground bones, yes, actual bones, or plaster of Paris. That's right, plaster. The same soothing substance used for sculptures, ceilings, and, unfortunately, criminated croissants. If you're starting to feel uneasy, rest assured. Many people of the era did too. Complaints were lodged, reports were written, but the vast, yeasty shadow cast by dishonest baking did not wither overnight. Health officials of the time, usually more focused on cholera outbreaks and perfume-based bathing, were not always swift to intervene, and thus bread remained a gambit, a doughy dice roll, pleasant to the nose, uncertain to the liver. Even the poor, who were less likely to enjoy the chic horrors of adulterated white bread, weren't entirely safe. Their loaves, often baked at home or purchased from modest market stalls, sometimes bore their own surprises. Insects, bits of chaff, or the occasional pebble, which added a certain rustic accent to one's chewing experience. But let us not cast too stern a crust upon the bakers. Many were simply doing what they could to survive a volatile grain market, where war, weather, and price tampering routinely sent flour costs into a dizzying spiral. To be a baker in 1780 was to be part alchemist, part gambler, and part scapegoat. Still, some laws did attempt to rein in these flowery follies. England passed the Bread Acts, which regulated the price and size of loaves, though enforcement was spotty at best. France, always dramatic when it comes to culinary matters, saw riots and revolts sparked by rising bread prices and poor quality. One could say the revolution itself had flour-covered fingerprints all over it. So next time you butter your toast or sniff a baguette, give a quiet nod of thanks for its relative safety, its lack of minerals, and the fact that it probably won't cause a small revolution in your spleen. As the embers of this chapter fade and the crust of memory turns gently golden, let your mind wander to flour's shadowy twin, the grinding stones and mills that made all of this possible. For it was in the mill house, beneath the watchful gaze of spinning wheels and suspicious cats, that flour's peculiar destiny was shaped. Chapter 3. The curious case of the lead-infused loaf. In the quiet corners of Georgian England, back when wigs were tall and hygiene was optional, bread held a place of unmatched reverence. It was, quite literally, the staff of life, the backbone of breakfast, the quiet hero of countryside suppers, and the crunchy foundation beneath many a questionable stew. But behind its golden crust, the loaf harbored a dark and powdery secret, a chemical villain so out of place that even poisoners might raise a powdered brow. Now, imagine it. A sleepy English village, fields dappled with early morning fog, sheep inventing new pronunciations of bar, and a miller whistling off-key as he fills burlap sacks with flour. A peaceful scene, tranquil even. Unless, of course, that sack of flour is laced, however accidentally, with white lead. Yes, lead. The same metal once used in makeup, plumbing, and disturbingly optimistic toddler toys. You see, in the 18th century, the demand for white, finely milled flour was so persistent it bordered on obsessive. No one wanted coarse and rustic brown bread. That was for paupers and poets. The real flex was snow-white bread that practically glowed with the aesthetic charm of economic instability. To meet the fashionable demand, millers, not all, but some with rather bendy ethics, would improve lower-grade flour with bone-white powders. Chalk was a favourite. Alum too, which perhaps you've last seen in your grandfather's shaving kit, but the most disturbing yet devilishly efficient enhancer. White lead. Now, just to be fair to the historical perpetrators, many didn't fully understand how dangerous lead was back then. They merely noticed that adding it made flour whiter and sometimes gave the bread a mild metallic crispness that customers seemed not to mind, or were too poisoned to complain about. And so, without much ado or regulation, bread became a chemistry experiment. Housewives sprinkled it over gruel for their infants. Pub owners used it to pad the pies of the common man. And the upper class? Oh, they sliced their dainty sandwiches ever so thin, oblivious to the heavy-handed seasoning of slow death. Curiously, nobody said much at first. The poisonings were subtle. A window cleaner's eyesight declined mysteriously. A schoolteacher began to forget the alphabet while simultaneously aging like soft cheese. Children grew wan and unfocused, and no one could quite figure out why breakfast was starting to feel more like a sedative than a morning ritual. But eventually, suspicion rose on the steam of common sense. Enter Sir Frederick Ackham, an intense German chemist with the eyebrows of a thunderstorm and an appetite for justice, or at least for ruining criminal bakers' careers. In the early 1800s, he published an alarmingly thorough exposé titled A Treatise on Adulterations of Food, a title that may have put a few readers to sleep, but not before scaring them breathless. Ackham, unlike most bedtime companions, could point out precisely how much arsenic was in your sugar, how much copper was in your pickles, and with grim calculation, how you might be slowly digesting a monument's worth of lead every time you buttered your morning toast. He was, one might say, the original food influencer, with a touch less quinoa and a touch more existential dread. The baker and the miller suddenly faced public scrutiny they'd never dreamed of, not because their bread was stale, but because their customers were. Laws began to shuffle into existence, wobbly and uncertain like a hungover magistrate. It would take decades, of course. Real change has always been slower than molasses in a January pantry. But murmurs of reform began to stir deep within Parliament, alongside the tea-time grumbles of indigestion. Still, your average townsperson carried on, sometimes quite literally carried, due to fainting from poorly sourced scones. But they carried on nonetheless, clinging to their crumpets with an admirable, if ill-informed resolve. As flickering candlelight danced on kitchen walls and the wind hummed through thatched roofs, the bread sat silently on every table, innocent, familiar, potentially fatal. And yet, with a slather of jam and a bit of clotted cream, still delicious. And so we drift onward, through flowery clouds of time and into quieter territory. Let your eyelids rest like cooling loaves on linen cloth. Somewhere nearby, a millstone turns, slow and steady. And on the breeze, there comes now the trace of another curious tale, one full of whispers, wealth, and a royal stomach that refused to play nicely. Chapter 4. The Rise and Fall of the Baker's Guild Beard. As the moon hangs like a pillowy loaf in the oven of the night sky, let's drift gently into the flower-dusted alleys of 18th century Europe, where bread reigned supreme, and so did the men who made it. But unlike today's artisan bread makers on Instagram, snapping selfies with sourdough, the bakers of the past were swaddled in mystery, pride, and occasionally very curious beards. Let us now peer ever so gently into the curious world of the medieval and early modern bakers' guilds, a world where dough was power, yeast was prestige, and facial hair was a rather serious matter. Guilds, you see, weren't just clubs where one could gab endlessly about crust consistency. These were powerful, semi-secretive societies that controlled everything from pricing to recipe protection. Think of them as the historical equivalent of LinkedIn, but with fewer endorsements and significantly more bread-based politics. The Bakers' Guild was a siblinghood of men, usually men, though we'll meet a few rebellious flory ladies later on, who believed that bread making was not just a trade, but a divine art form. And in many European cities, Paris, Lubeck, London, they wielded real civic influence. Mayors often feared them, priests blessed them, and children respected them simply because they smelled terrific. Now, here's where the beards come in. There was a peculiar custom, especially in parts of France and the German states, where master bakers often grew enormous, flour-dusted beards as a sign of their seniority, purity, and ability to endure 3 a.m. baking shifts without spiraling into existential despair. The longer the beard, the more respected the baker, though one imagines hygiene was occasionally questionable. In Paris, the flowery bearded bakers were sometimes referred to in jest as les nuages humains, the human clouds. They bore a stately resemblance to overcooked Santa Clauses, minus the reindeer, and plus a profound opinion on caraway seeds. The beards weren't just for show. In those soot-smudged bakehouses, beards were believed to grant senior bakers a certain mystique. Apprentices were told that only when your beard turned white with flour, and perhaps with a touch of humility, would you be ready to knead with the true passion of a master. They had elaborate rituals. To be admitted as a master baker, one often had to bake a perfect loaf, blindfolded, while being quizzed on grain prices and historical crust ratios. Failing meant starting over as an apprentice, or worse, being reassigned to oat porridge duty. Now, we must understand the hierarchy. At the bottom rung were the apprentices, young, wide-eyed, and perpetually dust-covered. Often orphans or sons of desperate shoemakers, they spent their early years fetching water, shoveling coal into brick ovens, and being told sternly not to touch the rising spelt. They were known for their underwhelming facial hair and overwhelming enthusiasm. Next came the journeymen. They'd graduated from basic bun shaping and could handle yeast with moderate confidence. They journeyed, hence the name, from city to city, loaf to loaf, often sleeping in baking halls by the glow of the oven's embers. Many wrote secret diary poems to rye flour. Few were published. And then, the masters. Oh, the masters. Looming above in both stature and eyebrow density, master bakers were revered. They negotiated contracts with towns, settled inter-guild disputes with dramatic shaking of baguettes, and orchestrated bread feasts after poor harvest to soothe starving masses with symbolic carb abundance. Some even held minor court positions, standing beside mayors at local festivals and throwing buns into crowds like medieval rock stars. But prestige came at a cost. With power, the bakers also drew suspicion. Were they hoarding grain, spoiling loaves to raise prices? That smell wafting from their shops, was it honest or alchemical? Guild bakers found themselves regular targets during economic unrest. In some bread riots, the town baker was the first to be pelted, not always with affection. Apprentice beards could not deflect blame. People wanted someone to blame for their hunger, and a man with 2 pounds of wheat in his moustache seemed a likely candidate. Still, their rituals endured. Across city after city, the soft-chewed rhythm of dough being slapped onto boards continued like a lullaby to civilization. The guilds regulated not just flour, but fairness, ensuring that swindling bakers were fined and that every peasant could count on a crust. As we float now, ever so lightly, out of the flickering ovens and warm guild halls, we notice the night yields soft secrets. The thrum of sleepless hands kneading dough and the rustle of aprons tell us that behind every crusty loaf is a legion of flour-flecked faces whispering age-old bakery chants. And just beyond the steam-streaked window panes, something new stirs in the wind. A powder not of yeast or rye, but of danger. For our next lull in the tale shall carry us into the shadowy world of powdered adulterants and one of the worst culinary decisions of the century. Chapter 5 of Mice, Mold and Musty Loaves. Let us drift now into the dim, flour-dusted corners of an 18th century bakehouse, where the ovens throbbed with heat and the shadows told strange, yeasty tales. Picture it: a crooked wooden sign creaking in the wind, the air filled with the fragrance of warm bread and something faintly off. Perhaps it's the presence of a mouse, or possibly mildew, or both. Best not to ask too many questions before bedtime. This was the golden age, or rather, the greyish-beige age, of bread baked with whatever was at hand. And sometimes, dear listener, what was at hand had no business being near an oven, or a mouth, especially not a mouth. But shortages and desperation are powerful, flour-spangled motivators. During the 1700s, bread wasn't just part of the meal, it was practically the meal itself. For the working poor, it could be up to 80% of the daily diet. The loaf was lifeblood, sustenance and comfort all rolled into a chewy middle with a slightly suspicious crust. Unfortunately, the sheer importance of bread made it a tempting target for unscrupulous bakers and even less scrupulous millers. Now, what happens, you ask sleepily, when demand outpaces morality? Enter our musty little villain, the mouldy grain. You see, grain stored improperly, say in damp, rat-infested cellars guarded by one-eyed cats named Maurice, tended to sprout a variety of colourful moulds. These weren't the simple blue and green gentlemen you find on forgotten sandwiches. Oh no, picture more sinister shades. Black ergot fungi clinging to rye like gloomy little hitchhikers from the microbial underworld. Ergot, specifically. Claviceps, purpurea, is what we might kindly call chaotic neutral in the fungal world. It didn't just sit there looking spooky. It messed with minds and bodies alike, bringing with it hallucinations, convulsions, and the occasional inexplicable impulse to join a monastery or stage a peasant uprising. The illness was called St. Anthony's fire, though the only thing holy about it were the fever dreams and the frantic prayers it inspired. Those who consumed ergot-infected bread might feel flames crawling beneath their skin, or believe they were on fire altogether. Not exactly your average continental breakfast. Surprisingly, or perhaps unsurprisingly, the sharp minds of the era weren't quick to blame their crusty companions. For centuries, bread was above moral suspicion. It was the dishonest miller, the stingy lord, the curse of God, or the devil himself, but never the cheerful little loaf on the table. And so it went. Moulded grains were ground into flour, flour was stirred into dough, and dough became bread, dangerous bread, often bought from market stalls shaded by canvas awnings and decorated with exactly 5 flies too many. In some towns, authorities attempted to regulate the baking trade with laws so old and crumbly they might have been made of bread themselves. There were rules about the price of loaves, the weight, even the whiteness, but rarely any enforcement about what actually went into them, as long as it vaguely resembled bread and weighed enough to make it look honest. It passed. Meanwhile, under the cover of hoods and fog and the occasional lightning bolt, certain millers and bakers began to experiment with enhancers. These included chalk to whiten, alum to preserve, and plaster of Paris to do something awful, presumably. These additives helped bakery thrive. Bread could look perfectly fine, snowy white, soft, lightly crackling, and still be about as digestible as a handful of gravel in a linen napkin. Mouldy grain, it turned out, was sometimes the least worrisome ingredient. Back in the corners of the bakehouse, the ovens glowed on. Night after night they swallowed up all manner of secrets, from bad grain to bad judgment. Their fires coaxed dough into shape, baking danger into form until it cooled into loaves sold with a smile and a shrug. The mold, if present, quietly disappeared in the heat, but its whispers remained in the bellies and dreams of the townsfolk. And so tonight, as you float towards sleep, spare a calm thought for the ghostly grains and the haunted crusts of yesteryear. The bread might have been warm, but its mysteries were not. Now let's gently close the oven door and turn our attention to the millstone itself, the mighty, grinding heart where flour was born and occasionally corrupted. Oh yes, next we shall roll quietly into the world of powdered pretenses. Chapter 6. The Dusty Alchemy of the Baker's Cloak. In the tender hush just before dawn, when chimney smoke curls upward like sleepy sighs and the world holds its breath under warming ovens, we find ourselves in an 18th century bakery, a place of comfort and menace, flour and fire, dough and quiet dreams. The baker stirs before the sun, and in those creaky, candle-lit hours, alchemy begins. Not the kind with gold, but with crust. Let us step inside gently, brushing flour from our sleeves, to witness the rituals of the early morning bread. But mind your lungs, this air is not so innocent. You see, in this time, not so long ago, and yet delightfully removed from the buzz of digital life, the humble baker was something of a hooded wizard, cloaked in a fine snow of flour, clasping wooden paddles like scepters, and muttering crusty incantations over bubbling dough. But behind the warmth and yeasty comfort of every rising loaf, there lurked a dangerous powder, far grimmer than dandruff, and only slightly less polite. We speak, of course, of flour dust. Ah yes, flour dust, known today as something that settles daintily on countertops and smugly refuses to sweep away. But in the 1700s, it was far more ambitious, for it had aspirations of combustion. It turns out, dear listener, careful now, don't drift just yet, that flour is highly flammable. Not when solidly packed in your jar, no, but when suspended in the air in fine particulate form, a floating constellation of wheat, it behaves less like food and more like gunpowder's shy cousin. The reason lies in science, which we will whisper rather than shout. The grain particles, when dispersed, have so much surface area exposed to oxygen that a single spark can kiss the air and cause an entire bakery to explode into a regrettable souffle. And here's the historical cream on this brittle pastry. Many bakeries did just that. Historical accounts, smoky and singed, tell us of flour mills vaporized in seconds. One moment, a worker was sneezing gently into his apron. The next, the ceiling took an unexpected interest in skydiving. One German flour mill in 1800, just slipping past our century, but let's allow it in for flavor, vanished when a spark from grinding stones met a cloudburst of flour. The entire operation went up like a crouton kissed by lightning. Bakers, it seems, were walking a fine, powdered line. Their very calling required them to trap this gentle peril within wooden walls surrounded by open flames. Ovens burned with wood or coal, workers lit candles, and on particularly windy days, flour might waltz into the air in adequate quantities to render the workplace an accidental artillery range. To mitigate disaster, some bakery owners began to redesign their spaces with flour safety in mind. Ventilation shafts trimmed with careful engineering, stone, walls that could contain minor flour tantrums, and even, on occasion, well-trained cats who were less about chasing mice and more about silently warning of sneezes, which could stir the air. Still, many bakeries clung stubbornly to older ways, trusting to luck and tradition. two notoriously unreliable employees. And so, in the early light of those flower-scented mornings, bakers lived with a quiet, dusty courage. They kneaded dough under the soft threat of combustion, laced with the aroma of patience. If bread is the staff of life, then bakeries were its fragrant minefields. Now, here's a warm crumb of delightful irony to tuck beneath your covers. Despite living with the risk of explosion, bakers were also some of the most trusted and beloved citizens of their neighborhoods. They rose early, fed the people, and filled every sleepy street with the aroma of rising hope. Flour may have been dangerous, but the bread was worth it. Just as stars are born in vast clouds of dust, so too was comfort born in the flowery fog of an 18th century morning. And so, we leave our baker, bowing slightly beneath his flowered hat, eyelids dipped like sleepy shutters, and hearth aglow with more than a little risk. Let us follow this warm trail of breadcrumbs, not into the forest, but softly into the margins, where a different ingredient begins to stir, curious and untrustworthy in its own way. Come now, we have more to rise. Chapter 7. The Curious Case of the Bleached Loaf. It was a sunny afternoon in 1790s London, a time when pigeons cooed over market stalls, chimney sweeps coughed on every corner, and a suspiciously white loaf of bread might actually be a crime scene in disguise. Let's ease into this, shall we? Close your eyes and imagine the scent of freshly baked bread winding through a cobbled alley, the kind that makes your mind go soft at the edges. Now imagine that same bread causing hallucinations, skin rashes, possibly even death. Dreamy, right? Our story picks up during what some historians call the Great Whitening. No, not a dental revolution, just one of bread. You see, in the hierarchy of 18th century grains, white bread was the king, the monarch, the Oscar-winning actor of the carbohydrate world. It symbolized refinement, wealth, and, for better or worse, an almost existential fear of brown bread. This posed a small problem. Flour, naturally, isn't very white. A gentle ivory at best, a creamy watercolor that says, "I'm natural, humble, and good for your digestion." But this wouldn't do for the fashionable folk of England's growing cities. Poorer people might gnaw on gritty, grey loaves full of bran and stray pebbles, but the upper crust, pun gently intended, demanded the palest slices, light as linen and just as lifeless. Enter the bleaching agents. Ah yes, dreamy chemicals. To achieve that aspirational hue of medical gauze, millers and unscrupulous bakers began blending flour with a variety of notoriously non-edible additives. Alum was a favorite, aluminum sulfate if you please, a mineral so versatile it could fix cloth dyes and bake your intestines at the same time. Alum made bread look white, fluffy, and wholesome. It even gave it a springy bite. What a treat. Except that in large enough doses, it also happened to interfere with, well, being alive. Consumers, unaware, graciously consume lab-level experiments with every morning toast. Crumb by crumb, they ingested what today would be politely labelled non-food substances and impolitely labelled, "Dear God, that's in bread." And it wasn't just alum. Chalk made appearances too. Yes, the very substance Victorian schoolchildren squeaked across blackboards went into bellies before it went onto slates. Why? Because it was white and cheap and surely wouldn't kill anyone immediately. This is where things take a mildly tragicomic turn. The working class, desperate to mimic the luxuries of their wealthier neighbours, began to demand the same pristine loaves. They didn't know that the secret ingredient was less grandma's love and more chemistry set. people began buying bleached bread for weddings, Sundays, and any day where dignity was required with jam. Right alongside powdered wigs and lead makeup, the empire dined on poison with the elegance of silver cutlery. Of course, not everyone was on board with this ghostly gluten trend. Medical professionals, those brave few not yet bled dry by leeches, started noticing odd patterns. Children with bellyaches, mothers with odd neurological symptoms, entire families fainting after supper. The bread, it seemed, didn't love them back. In 1757, a concerned physician named Dr. George Fordyce waded nobly into the wheat-based madness. He wrote essays rather alarmingly titled On the Danger of Alum in Bread. People nodded, then promptly forgot, because white bread was beautiful and dangerously addictive. Still, not all was lost. The rise of bread adulteration invited the birth of something rather marvelous: the public analyst. This delightfully Victorian role was essentially the original food inspector, a person whose job it was to snoop about bakeries, collect samples, and yell politely about poison in Parliament. Laws slowly, and I do mean slowly, crept onto the books. By the late 1800s, bread adulteration was at least officially discouraged. Whether it stopped entirely, well, that's a flaky tale for another day. But in the wheat-whitened haze of the 18th century, caution was still a whisper. The people wanted their loaves cloud-coloured, even if a bit of heaven came with a dose of chemical dizziness. So the next time you nibble something suspiciously pale, consider this: behind every white slice was once a long line of millers, bakers, and daring eaters who decided that beauty really did come with a cost. And sometimes that cost was stomach cramps or a very ghostly complexion. Now, let us float onward like a breadcrumb in the fog to a question that plagued the more discerning household. If you couldn't trust the bread, could you trust the baker? Let's take a dreamy little stroll there next. Chapter 8: The Millstone Murmurs and the Curious Tale of Flour Dust. Imagine, if you will, a countryside morning in late 18th century Yorkshire. The fog hasn't quite lifted, roosters are asleep on the job, and somewhere, deep within the bones of an old stone mill, gears start to groan like an elderly librarian asked to dance. Welcome to the mystical heart of the flour-making process, the grist mill, where wheat becomes flour, and danger wears a dusty white coat. Let's settle in here among the rhythm of turning wheels and the whisper of centuries-old wooden flumes. There's quite the tale to be told, not about the bread we've been following, oh no, but about the birth of its key ingredient, flour. Because once upon a grinding time, flour dust wasn't just a sneezy inconvenience. It was a quiet assassin, floating in the air like an over-enthusiastic ghost. You see, in the 1700s, mills were more than just scenic backdrops for oil paintings and insurance commercials. They were industrial powerhouses, which is quite impressive, considering they ran purely on the enthusiasm of rivers and the strategic angling of wooden paddles. No buttons, no electricity, just the drone of millstones grinding grain into the pale, silky powder of sustenance. But here's the sleepy twist. When flour becomes airborne in enclosed spaces and meets even the smallest flame, it behaves less like a baking ingredient and more like an impromptu explosion artist. That's right. Flour dust is flammable, not in a polite candle flicker kind of way, but in a mill goes boom sort of fashion. This little-known threat was first noted not by chemists in lab coats, but by millers who suddenly found parts of their workplace dramatically airborne. Picture poor Thomas the miller, middle-aged and dust-covered, whistling a tune at his grindstone when someone brings in a lantern. The resulting poof sends Thomas into early retirement and places his hat gently in a tree several yards away. The science behind this sleepy peril is surprisingly delicate in its logic. Tiny flour particles suspended in air have a massive combined surface area. Add ignition, like a spark from a metal tool or the world's most ill-advised pipe smoke break, and voila, a flash fire made of baked goods aspirations. By the late 1700s, news of flour explosions became almost folkloric among milling communities. It was said in hushed voices, often over mugs of stout, "Keep your embers out of the airing floor, or you'll light up quicker than a goose on fire." A baffling analogy, yes, but goose fires were apparently common enough to be useful metaphors at the time. The Industrial Revolution, that ever-anxious architect of chaos, only made things worse. With the proliferation of larger, closed-in mills and fancier, faster equipment, dust concentration reached new and impressive heights. One errant flame could now level an entire building. Yet, many mill owners remained as blissfully unaware as a cat near an open piano. Of course, inventiveness often dances hand in hand with disaster. Some clever souls began devising new ventilation solutions, primitive dust collection systems, and even the idea of separating grinding rooms from flame sources. A dazzlingly obvious suggestion in hindsight. Millwrights, the engineers of their age, huddled over blueprints that included things like windows and open air. And by the mid-19th century, deaths by flour had thankfully gone out of vogue. Still, in the 18th century, if you were a hard-working miller, chances were high you'd come home each evening coated in a fine sift of flour and carrying the quiet knowledge that your job was slightly more explosive than the average bake sale. Some folklore even began assigning supernatural qualities to flour dust. They said it could steal your breath, cloud your mind, and tempt the reaper with its ghost-like mist. Whether or not these tales had any truth didn't matter. What mattered was that people started to whisper respectfully near the mill house and perhaps left their fire sticks at the door. And now, dear listener, as the mill slows to its sleepy spin and our flour settles once more into its bags and barrels, we drift gently toward another chapter of our story. For while some flour swirled in silence, other ingredients began picking up peculiar guests. What happens when bread meets mystery meat? Well, best keep your candle dim for that. Chapter 9. The Baker's Apprentice and the Mystery of the Greenish Glow. If you were to wander the twisty cobblestone streets of 18th century Paris, in the quiet amber hush before sunrise, before the bakers began their daily alchemy of turning flour into crusty gold, you might see something peculiar if you looked too closely. A faint green shimmer wafting from a bread oven, or perhaps a soft twinkle upon a cooling loaf. Charming, maybe. Radioactive, possibly. Welcome to the era when bread, in its innocent-looking splendor, sometimes betrayed a subtle shimmer. Not because it was graced by the hand of a kindly bread fairy, but because it had been stored next to paint. You see, the French, for all their cultural sophistication, had a flair for unfortunate storage decisions. Parisian pantries were often cramped, meshed in with cellars that stored anything from onions to inks, firewood to, alas, Dutch lead paint pigments. And among the most treacherous of these pigments, verdigris. Verdigris was beautiful, a haunting seafoam green made by suspending copper plates above vats of vinegar. The fumes would slowly corrode the copper, creating a flaky patina prized by painters and, for some reason, French municipal decorators. Unfortunately, this pigment found its way onto wood barrels, shelf corners, and, occasionally, flour sacks, One moment you're storing your artistic supplies, and the next, that flour is whispering sweet toxic nothings into your baguette dough. Imagine young Etienne, a baker's apprentice with enthusiastic hair and sleepier dreams, beginning his dawn routine. He pulls flour from the cellar, not noticing the colourful crust clinging to the linen sack. His master, old Monsieur Robard, is too focused on yelling, "Mind the crust ratio," to notice the subtle chartreuse hue to the new batch. Into the dough it goes, kneaded, rested, baked with love, and just a pinch of heavy metal seasoning. Verdigris wasn't the only culprit in this pastel palette of peril. Bread sometimes took on all kinds of hues thanks to cross-contamination from other cleverly disguised poisons. Arsenic, for example, enjoyed a lively career as a rat deterrent in granaries, and while that's a noble trade, its ambitions often extended to human stomachs. Arsenic powder was tasteless, which made it, in those charming pre-FDA centuries, both perfect for pest control and popular among less than faithful heirs. Of course, no one meant for bread to glow. It wasn't a culinary trend. Yet it happened often enough that mystified reports circulated in hushed tones and frightening pamphlets. In one case, a physician in Poitiers wrote of a glowing loaf considered possessed either by devil or phosphorus. Parish priests were called to examine loaves believed to be cursed. Bread was burned not for being stale, but for suspicious luminescence. It glowed, ergo it must be evil. But let's not blame just the paint and poison. Some of that eerie shimmer turned out to have a more fungal origin. Yes, mold. Glorious, strange mold. Under the right damp conditions, and with a little help from phosphorescent fungi, loaves could develop a natural luminescence. Nature's nightlight, calmly carcinogenic. Bakers began to whisper superstitions about how glowing bread meant bad harvests or worse love lives. One bakeress in Lyon was convinced that each flicker of green she saw meant her cat had betrayed her. And in Montpellier, there was a street rhyme that went, "If thy bread doth shine at night, hide thy spoon and skip the bite." And so bread glowing in the night, a phenomenon nobody wanted and everyone feared, slipped into the fog of food lore. It sat somewhere between real science and bedtime superstition. By the time authorities finally investigated these phosphorescent pastries, they were met with a great Gallic shrug and the suggestion that perhaps the bread was just too fresh. Eventually, cellars were better ventilated, pigment barrels removed, and poor verdigris was rebranded as a painterly thing, not a pantry spice. And young Etienne, the sleepy apprentice, went on to invent a rustic rye so dense it could double as building material. It didn't glow, but if you dropped it, it echoed. Now, let your mind wander through the maze of moonlit bakeries, where flour drifts like snowfall and secrets hide between the crusts. Our next tale stirs in a different bowl, one where the bread wasn't just deadly, it was criminal. Chapter 10. The Baker's Invisible Battle, Mold, Mice, and Midnight Meddling. The sun had long since dipped below the soot-smeared rooftops of 18th century London, but in the lower quarters of the baker's world, the true drama was only just beginning. While the rest of society slipped into uneasy sleep, dreaming of powdered wigs and polite duels, bakers fought their invisible war, not with swords or cries, but with flour sacks, damp walls, and a mouse population that seemed to believe they'd inherited the shop through some legal loophole. You see, bread making in the 1700s wasn't just flour, water, and the occasional sigh of hope. It was a hazardous occupation, where every element conspired against you. The building groaned like a sick grandfather. Yeast could go rogue at the slightest breeze, and your competitors, desperate, secretive, and sometimes disturbingly resourceful, might sneak in at night to meddle with your loaves. Ah yes, the tales of rival bakers and their mischievous espionage. Few remember them now, but once upon a doughy time, it wasn't unheard of for a jealous baker to toss a little alum or chalk into someone else's flour barrel, all under the veil of midnight. Very illegal, very immoral, very dusty. And it wasn't just human saboteurs that stalked the night. Pests, too, had their own policies. Mice, for instance, operated what one might describe as an adorable but relentless black market bakery within the bakery. They had secret entry routes through forgotten chimney cracks and under broken flagstones, treating flour bins like open buffets. There were cats, of course, noble in theory, but notoriously disinterested in rodent control by their second week of employment. And then came the mold, quiet, creeping, the original slow-moving horror. It loved damp walls, adored the smell of overripe yeast, and made a nuisance of itself by ruining whole batches when no one was watching. The walls of older bakehouses absorbed water like a bad secret, and the mold would thrive. Not bright green with the decency of visibility, but pale and sickly, almost philosophical in its refusal to be defined. It would drift through flour like a thief in powdered boots, leaving your morning loaves looking fine but tasting like regret. To combat this trifecta of nightly torment, mice, mold, and meddling, bakers became night watchmen in their own right. Some devised elaborate contraptions with bells tied to cupboard handles, so the slightest movement would give away a rodent or a rival's damp spark of mischief. Others stuck to more traditional methods, like highly aggressive tabby cats or suspiciously timed cousin visits that lasted until the break of dawn. The baker's life was so filled with threats from the unseen that it bordered on spiritual. Some regarded bread as being directly vulnerable to curses, especially among those whose loaves refused to rise for inexplicable reasons. In York, around 1739, a rumour swirled that a rival had placed an evil blessing upon a village baker's oven, causing every crust to crack too early, disrupting the sacred softness of every crumb. The baker, determined not to be outdone, paid a wandering herbalist to sprinkle dandelion tea and whisper contradictions into the flames. Did it work? Not really. But it did get the local children curious and the bread tasting vaguely floral for the next month. In truth, the invisible battle was more about endurance than victory. Bakers survived not because of perfect science, but through an alchemy of sleep deprivation, inherited stubbornness, and the conviction that everyone deserved bread. However questionably, it had been protected the night before. And despite the nightly invasions, the sabotage, the smirking mice, and the theatre of molds, the baker's shop would open at sunrise, smelling of effort and slightly singed linen. It was a reassuring constant, like the stars or the one man who kept wearing wigs well into the 19th century out of spite. So as we drift now into quieter thoughts, think kindly of those early bakers, guardians of the loaf and soldiers of the crumb. Their unseen wars ensured that morning still arrived with bread on the table, even if it occasionally crackled from the inside with a hint of mildew. Next, we'll step into the world of those very bread buyers, the canny, the careless, and the bread-testing nibblers, who brave the streets for a warm crust and perhaps, unknowingly, a dose of something a bit more creative. Chapter 11. The Mysterious Case of the Dancing Bakers Guild. As the moonlight tiptoes through your curtains and sleep slowly loops the laces of your tired thoughts, we drift now into the powdered world of the bakers. Not just any bakers, mind you, but the guild-bonded, flour-dusted, ever-watchful members of the bakers' guilds of 18th century Europe. They ruled the ovens with an iron peel. Back then, bread was not merely food. It was a sacred utility, a currency of the poor, and a metric by which kings measured contentment among the peasants. The making of bread was therefore not left to chance or cheerful amateurs. No, it was managed, mandated, and monitored by tightly woven guilds, like little yeasty governments of their own. Guilds were the medieval version of quality control, with just a dash of secret society intimidating flair. Picture it: a long wooden table, wigs powdered fluffier than a croissant, a roaring hearth at one end, and at the other, a committee of serious-faced bakers who took their loaves more seriously than bishops took the Bible. You had to earn your way into the guild: apprenticeship, examination, and finally, the ceremonial needing of approval. To pass the final test, legend says one had to bake a perfect loaf, crusty, golden, and hollow sounding when tapped, while blindfolded, and standing on one leg during a thunderstorm. All right, perhaps only 2 of those things were true. The bakers' guilds had rules. Oh, did they? Working hours, flour quality, oven temperatures, and most importantly, the sacred weight of a loaf. Not a crumb more, not a crumb less. Too light, fine, too heavy, possibly witchcraft. And heaven help you if you tried to bake bread in secret without a license. That was called unlawful baking, and it was considered a high crime against the doughy divine order. One man in 1748 was caught baking bootleg brioches in his cottage oven outside of guild authority. He was marched through town, punished by a public display, while carrying 3 enormous stale loaves around his neck. It was a soggy humiliation, but the purpose behind all this sternness was both noble and necessary. Flour, you see, was deadly, highly adulterated, unpredictable, and easily spoiled. And bread was eaten in such staggering quantities, often making up nearly 80% of a poor person's daily caloric intake. That poor bread meant poor health, sometimes worse. So bakers had to be beholden to someone who could taste test their trade and smell a tainted sack of flour from across the alley. But sometimes even the sacred guilds got it wrong, or perhaps got a little too fancy with their fellow guildsmen at their annual banquets. Ah yes, the annual banquet, a ceremonial feast where bakers from all over the city would join together in flowery fellowship, white aprons swapped for velvet waistcoats, oven mitts given a holiday, and bread-themed ballads sung in minor keys. Now, rumour has it, and this is where it gets delightfully dreamy, that during a 1762 banquet in Strasbourg, the guild dancers suffered a most peculiar bout of unintentional choreography. They danced and twitched and stumbled for hours uncontrollably. It wasn't just spirited joy. There were spasms, strange chanting, and hours of exhausting motion. Historians now believe the bread served that evening may have contained ergot, yes, our old fungal friend. As charities are prone to do, someone may have been generous with old rye flour, inadvertently creating not just loaves, but a very localized outbreak of dancing plague. Was it a case of coincidental food poisoning? Or perhaps the bakers, overexposed to floury air and underexposed to skepticism, simply slipped into a strange, sleep-like frenzy together, swaying to the rhythm of ancient grain hallucinations. Some whispered that the banquet was cursed. Others said it was just too much mead and not enough manners. Either way, the Dancing Bakers Guild incident became legend. whispered like old yeast through the iron gates of flour mills for generations. Of course, the next year's banquet removed rye bread from the menu entirely. Just to be safe. They say one baker never stopped dancing. He simply pirouetted down the alleys, tossing croutons with abandon, eventually opening a tavern where patrons were required to enter in waltz position. But the world of grain has more stories to share. From persecuted millers to whispered, powdered conspiracies, a new chapter curls its corners gently in the warm hearth of history. Chapter 12. The perilous pursuit of whiteness, in bread, not fashion. The moonlight drifts gently across cobbled streets, caressing the dormant signs of 18th century bakeries, gold-painted loaves swinging slightly in the night breeze, and behind shuttered windows and stone walls, flour settles in sacks and barrels like fine, pale snow, patiently waiting for morning's fires and hands. Let's rise quietly into one of these shops now, with flour dust suspended in a breathless hush. It's 1783, and all across Britain and France, bakers are engaged in something of a tasteful arms race, a quest to bake the whitest bread imaginable, a prize more coveted than flavour or even safety. You see, white bread was never just food. It was a statement, a status symbol, a pale badge of civility smeared with a bit of butter. To serve your guests a crusty, cream-coloured loaf was to declare both refinement and that you played the social game quite nicely, thank you. But here's where the dough gets a little dubious. Wheat flour, in its natural state, contains bran and germ, components that give it colour. A warm beige, if you will. Loving, natural, slightly nutty. But therein lay the problem. Beige bread was considered, rather unjustly, the food of lower classes. So clever lads with mortar and pestle took it upon themselves to make bread quite literally whiter than nature intended. And how? Well, here's where things turn from wheat to woe. One choice additive, alum. Not the musical tempo, mind you, but a mineral compound, usually potassium aluminum sulfate. Now, technically speaking, alum had uses in medicine and textiles, but bakers discovered it also made bread look perfectly snow white and fluffier than a bishop's wig. Unfortunately, when ingested in significant amounts, alum had a peculiar tendency to incapacitate the human digestive system ever so artistically. Nausea, cramping, occasional dramatic death. You know, the kind of things one might label as minor inconveniences in pursuit of a fancier sandwich. But bakers were rewarded for their pallid performances. Whiteness meant wealth, and many customers, utterly unaware of the chemical shenanigans within each innocent slice, were lining up, coins in hand and toast on their minds. Regulations? Well, those were still dozing in some high-backed chair at a government office, sipping watered-down tea. For much of the 18th century, bread laws were vague, outdated, or charmingly ignored. While the assize of bread had previously dictated weights and prices, its power had waned. Now, shady millers and entrepreneurial bakers were free to peddle improved flours laced with all manner of mystery. Of course, alum wasn't the only whitening wonder. Chalk powder was also a crowd favourite. Yes, the same chalk once used to diagram humiliating defeats on classroom blackboards. It does whiten things, and tragically, human stomach linings too. The logic was strangely consistent. If it looked elegant and cost less, why not add it? Bone ash. Occasionally, lye. Sometimes in small crimes against croissants. Now, not all bakers were villainous villains. Many were genuine craftsmen hopelessly caught in the powdered peer pressure. Competition was fierce. If your neighbour achieved a more porcelain loaf than you your sales dropped like a badly risen sponge cake. And so, even the honest ones, those who perhaps once ground flour between millstones with song in their hearts, began to dabble in the whiter arts. Across the Channel, France began to suffer its own crises of crumb. During famines and food shortages, synthetic dilutions and improvised extensions were common, sometimes out of desperation rather than greed. Sawdust was not unheard of as a filler. It did, after all, add fiber. And the government? Often more interested in preventing riots than monitoring flour. Eventually, medical practitioners began to raise powdered eyebrows. Reports surfaced linking chronic stomach conditions and toxic symptoms to the very bread that everyone adored. But since everyone was eating it, denial became a group activity. It can't be the bread, they mused, while clutching their middles in agony. It must be something less charming. Back in dim-lit kitchens, bakers quietly added their alum and chalk, dusting each loaf with a gentle, potentially lethal kiss. The ovens glowed with warm deceit, and outside the fog passed lamplighters and milk carts, unaware that danger lurked in the very heart of toast. As we quietly close the oven door and tiptoe away from the milky madness of bread beautification, we enter a new stage of history's curious banquet. Something was coming, something with steam, steel, and a little toot. We'll lay our heads for now, but just past the bakery's edge of slumber, the iron horse begins to stir its sleepy whistle. Chapter 13. The Yeast That Roared But Only a Little. Let us drift ever so gently into the warm and curious world of yeast, a fungus so humble it rarely gets applause, yet so vital that a good loaf of bread would crumble without it. Tonight, we turn our gaze toward the microscopic mischief maker that made bread rise and, on unfortunate days, occasionally made humans fall. In the late 1700s, bakers across Europe were in a steady tango with yeast. But back then, they didn't fully understand what yeast actually was. It was more mysterious air magic that bubbled dough when the weather was right. Bakers kept sourdough starters like prized house cats, temperamental, yeast-filled creatures that demanded daily attention and smelled a little strange, but which produced dependable companionship, in this case, in the shape of edible spongy pillows. Some believed the key to good bread lay in celestial alignment. Others blamed their failed crusts on angry neighbors or a scandalously cold north wind. But mostly, success came down to the invisible world of fermentation, and more often than not, hope. You see, yeast wasn't sold in tidy foil cubes or packets. No, it was captured, fermented from air, aged from beer vats, begged from successful neighbors with thriving loaves. Brewer's yeast, that chalky-cheeked cousin from the alehouse, often moonlighted as baker's yeast. It lent both rise and risk, depending on whether it brought helpful microbes or unwanted guests, like mold and other suspicious companions. Some historians believe that certain village bakers kept their own secret yeasts, fermentations passed down through generations, protected like precious heirlooms. Not quite jewelry, not quite livestock, possibly more temperamental than both. In sleepy English towns and cobblestone French quarters, these bubbling jars of living cultures would whisper and fizz, slightly sour, slightly sweet, and potentially slightly perilous. Because here's the curious part. Not all yeast was created equal, and some fermentations left unchecked invited unwelcome bacteria. In a time before germ theory, it was all trial, error, and the occasional tragic cupcake. Bread could unknowingly become host to Clostridium bacteria or Stachybotrys mold, what modern folk might call things that really ought not be in your breakfast. Imagine a dotty old baker in 1794, stirring her sourdough starter by lamplight, watching the bubbles rise like tiny edible stars. There's a warmth to the room, both literal and metaphorical, but as fermentation did its twinkling biological work, little did she know that an overactive culture or too warm storage might cultivate more than simple gas, perhaps a touch of botulism, or a whiff of mycotoxin. Cases of bread-induced illness were often blamed on less likely culprits: bad ovens, cursed flour, or the left foot of a witch who scowled too loudly at the dawn. The idea that tiny, unseen organisms could wreak havoc on the digestive system. Not even a bedtime rumor. And so, in the gentle murmur of bread ovens, the yeast of old danced its microbial ballet. Sometimes it spun with divine grace, creating loaves full of air and warmth. Other times, it stumbled. Poisonings were rare but memorable. Diaries from the era speak in puzzled tones of winter stomach fits and baker's sickness, a term that might well translate to, we don't know what's wrong, but definitely don't eat the rye loaf. Curiously, in parts of Scandinavia and North Germany, where dark rye breads reign supreme, the fierce flavour of bitter, sour starters seemed to both delight and fortify the local constitution. These sourdoughs were not a soft affair, thick, chewy, with the moral weight of a philosophy book and the lifespan of a legend. A single rye loaf could last a week, a political term, or a mild famine. It was food, it was furniture. It may have been used as a weapon once. But as lovely as all this bubbling sounds, there was always a cautionary thread stitched beneath the crust. Mold grew quietly in larders. Starters turned wrong when the weather changed. And in the absence of thermometers and microscopes, bakers leaned on instincts passed down over flowery handshakes and whispered measurements. If your mother's mother said knead until the dough sighs, that's what you did. And somehow the bread rose, most of the time. So rest now, dear listener, amid the warmth of ancient kitchens and the scent of good intentions. As the yeast sighs and the oven glows, we tuck away this chapter like a sleepy loaf, left to rest and rise. And in the hush between dreams and dough, we shall drift further into the fires that followed. Chapter 14. The Curious Case of the Floating Crusts. Let us drift now to the bakeries of Georgian Britain, where the simple act of baking bread was sometimes more alchemy than cuisine, and occasionally a low-stakes crime of deception. It was an age when bread was simultaneously feared and revered, like a cat with a temperamental mop of flour. But amid arsenic-laced loaves and alum-dusted misery, there emerged another curious tale, this one involving floating crusts. No poisons, no prison sentences, just an odd buoyancy and a burgeoning mistrust of bubbles. This story begins, as many odd English stories do, with manners and tea and a bread roll behaving dubiously at dinner. In the mid-1700s, a scandal began to rise, both metaphorically and physically, when Londoners noticed that some loaves, particularly those from less reputable bakers, were suspiciously airy. Not delightfully light, mind you, like a French brioche floating on a Parisian breeze, but unsettlingly hollow. When torn open, the interiors could resemble spongy caverns or, heaven forbid, a baker's half-hearted lie. The real issue, however, revealed itself during one of those delicate upper-class social dinners, where a crust was dropped into a bowl of broth and, to the horror of the lady of the house, the crust refused to sink. It bobbed. It bobbed like a tiny yeasty lifeboat refusing to go down with the soup. Now, this might seem adorable, but in 18th century England, floating crusts signaled treachery. To understand why, we must examine the era's popular bread test, the fabled sink test. This remarkably unscientific but widely beloved method involved placing a chunk of bread in water. Wholesome bread, it was believed, would sink like an honest man's conscience. Fraudulent, adulterated bread, fat with deception and too much gas, would float, or bounce, or worse, fizz. The floating of bread crusts caused an uproar. Investigations were launched. Local newspapers railed. One pamphlet titled "On the Unlawful Levity of Bread" emerged anonymously. It was equal parts culinary critique and quite possibly satire. While no one knows the author, scholars suspect he might have been a disgruntled baker or a poet overly sensitive to gastrointestinal betrayal. Bakers defended themselves, of course. Some cleverly argued that the buoyancy came from improved fermentation techniques. More air equaled a more digestible product. Well, relatively digestible. After all, this still was a century when people worried that cabbage might give you tragic melancholy and that clotted cream could disorder your humours. But others, less scrupulous sorts, simply pumped dough with chalk. Yes, chalk and soapstone, and even quicklime, which is probably not something you'd like swirled into your breakfast roll. The uneasy public began testing their bread at home. Households across England, particularly among the increasingly literate middling sort, took to dunking toast into bowls with sombre gravity, reading the results like soggy tea leaves. Floating? Foul? Sinking sharply? Splendid? Slowly drifting? Suspicious? This in-home food testing led to unintended side quests of culinary paranoia. Samples were stored in dresser drawers and papered boxes for long-studied observation. Some people became so obsessed they were labelled bread watchers by their families. And according to one kindly vicar's diary, his wife forbade him from conducting further aquatic trials in the family basin. Interestingly, some bakers, realizing the power of perception, began crafting loaves specifically to sink. Entirely ignoring actual flavor or nutritional value, they baked low-risen bricks more suitable for building extensions than feeding children. All simply to pass the sink test with aplomb. Naturally, all of this bread-based pseudoscience gave rise to grifters, middlemen who billed themselves as bread testers and charged fees to declare loaves either innocent or bubbled with deceit. Their methods, secretive. Their robes, flowing. Their credibility, flaky at best. And yet, amid the floating crusts and fraudulent flour, something rather lovely lingered. A deep, heartfelt belief that bread ought to be trustworthy, warm, honest and dependable. The sort of companion you could butter and believe in. So next time you dunk a toast corner into your tea, give a nod of respect to those common households of old, quietly deducing truth through bread and broth. As night drifts in and your pillow flattens gently beneath you, let your mind float, not unlike a suspicious dinner roll, toward the countryside, where winds shifted, swine wandered, and a particularly gothic tale of bread misfortune was about to unfold. Chapter 15. The Yeasty Whispers of the Windmill. If you listen closely enough to a field of swaying wheat on a lazy afternoon, and I do recommend it, if only to escape the aggressive modern ambition of spreadsheets and double-booked calendars, you might hear it sighing softly in the breeze, murmuring memories of another time. A time when the simplest of foods could carry within its golden crust a pinch of poison, a spoonful of scandal, and a cloud of mysterious death. Tonight, dear listener, we turn our gaze skyward, or at least windmill-ward. Let us drift gently to the 18th century countryside, where towering wooden windmills peppered Europe's horizon like sleepy giants yawning across the grain fields. These were not the polite, tourist-ready Dutch postcard mills we're used to admiring while nibbling stroopwafels. No, these were creaky, temperamental contraptions, part bakery, part beast, tirelessly gnashing grain to dust, all powered by the wind and the hope that one wouldn't lose an arm adjusting the sails. The men who operated them, millers, and millers, eternal suspects in the great bread mystery. Millers, you see, had a reputation that was, let's say, as questionable as the flour they ground. In village gossip and whispered pub talk, millers were ranked just below lawyers and above tax collectors. They were famously suspected of siphoning more than just flour from the sacks they were paid to process. We're talking strategic skims here, a subtle scoop, a ladle for the ladle lord. This dodgy accounting was so prolific that Shakespeare, in his infinite sass, wrote of honest millers with the same incredulity one might reserve for modest peacocks. But what really made things dangerously dreamy in the flour world was the potential sabotage of the mill itself. Yes, sabotage. With windmills being the centre of community grain grinding operations, all it took was a well-aimed scoop of spoiled rye or poor sanitation, and voila, an entire village could be rendered raving. Or worse, raving and dead, which tends to put a damper on the quarterly town market. The culprit behind many of these episodes was Claviceps purpurea, a fun little fungus with a not-so-fun effect. Better known as ergot, it could cling to rye as innocently as a child to its parent's leg, and yet inside brewed chaos. Once milled into flour and baked into bread, ergot could unleash an onslaught of grotesque symptoms. Limbs gone numb, skin gone black, and minds quite entirely gone. This, incidentally, presented an exciting challenge for millers to somehow keep the grain clean without the benefit of microscopes or modern health codes. Not to mention the ongoing pressure from village bakers demanding ever whiter, ever softer flour. It was the equivalent of asking someone to operate a rocket with a windsock and a strong hunch. Now, when one of these mysterious bread-induced illnesses swept through a town, townsfolk were quick to blame, well, everything. Witches, usually, or the foreign spice merchant. But most often, they turned their pitchforks toward the windmill and the man who lived curiously alone within it. Why hadn't he caught the mold? Did he grind the rye too fast? Was he in league with Satan and supplying spiced loaves to Lucifer? The miller's cat, known in several tales as having suspiciously bright eyes, seldom helped matters. Still, some windmill operators were diligent, even scientific in their rituals. They sun-dried their grain. They checked for discoloration. They whispered sweet nothings to their grindstones, and in rare cases, they even turned away suspicious rye. A very bold move, given that senile Lord Farthingham's entire crop happened to be suspicious, and he was also the village magistrate. But even the best precautions weren't always enough. After all, spores are sneaky things, and a gust of poorly timed mist, or 2 lazy days of damp storage, could turn a household's flour cask into a fungal feast. By the time the bread was sliced, it was less a meal and more an unknowable gamble. Picture a sleepy supper disrupted by hallucinations of dancing goats, followed by someone attempting to converse with a turnip. The windmill then was both lifeline and powder keg, whirling its arms in the breeze like some enchanted sentinel. And just as it turned steadily with the weather, so too did miller fortunes shift, all with the whims of rye, the will of wind, and the quiet march of invisible mould. As our flowery tale turns onward, let us tiptoe from the creaky wooden planks of rustic mills to the fire-lit hearths of the humble baker, where rising dough held secrets just as strange. Chapter 16. The Curious Case of the Bread Inspector and His Pocket Spoon. Let us drift now to a quiet little corner of 18th century England, where a man in an ill-fitting waistcoat walked solemnly through the marketplace, carrying great power and a teaspoon. His name, simply, the Bread Inspector. He was not a baker, nor a nobleman, nor even especially fond of sandwiches. But in a world where bread could kill you, or at the very least, dramatically inconvenience your insides, this unassuming figure was appointed by local officials to inspect the loaves of the realm. He was the carbohydrate whisperer, if you will. Now, in modern times, inspecting bread isn't generally a matter of public safety, unless you're fearfully gluten intolerant or suspicious of sourdough. But in the 1700s, bread was the thing. It wasn't just a foodstuff. It was a cultural pillar, the edible equivalent of tea, gossip, and ill-tempered weather. Most of society ran on it, from farmhand to factory child. So when flour became suspect, contaminated with chalk, ground bones, or the legendary alum powder, things became very crumby indeed. Enter our bread inspector, a man whose job required no weapons, just a serious expression and a spoon of modest size. Yes, inspectors were instructed to test random loaves with their spoons, breaking off pieces of crust, feeling the grain of the crumb, and occasionally licking suspicious white specks to determine whether they were flour or something more theatrical. It must be said, this was not always a glamorous gig. Bread inspectors were often mocked by bakers and pelted with crumbs when they got too enthusiastic. On one occasion, a particularly meticulous inspector in Kent was chased down the street by 5 furious millers wielding baguettes like cavalry sabres. No one was hurt, but many biscuits were crushed in the ruckus. Still, for every scoffing baker, there was a grateful townsman who no longer had to wonder whether his daily loaf had been enhanced with powdered soap. The role of the inspector was officially backed by bread acts. Yes, multiple acts of parliament about bread. The most famous being the Bread Act of 1757, a stern yet flowery document that outlined how much wholesomeness could be demanded of a loaf before it began to insult the intelligence of the buyer. And while this might sound absurd, it was deadly serious. Adulterants like alum weren't just digestive nuisances, they could be fatal. The powder gave bread a lovely white appearance, much like snow or a powdered wig, but prolonged exposure could damage kidneys, bones, and whatever faith one had left in human decency. Yet because finer white breads fetched higher prices, there was a real incentive to, shall we say, sweeten the dough in toxic ways. Thus, the humble bread inspector marched on, spoon in hand and parchment in pocket, battling invisible powders for the sake of the common stomach. There are, believe it or not, archived letters from these men. In one 1762 note, an inspector complained of losing his bread neutrality after accidentally complimenting a particularly fluffy but alum-laced bun. He later recanted his praise publicly in the town square, describing the loaf as a villainous construction resembling both cotton and treason. He was reassigned to oatmeal patrol shortly thereafter. Their work extended beyond ingestion. Inspectors also helped regulate the weight of bread, which was prone to fluctuation due to various creative kneading techniques and the occasional dishonest finger pressing down on the scales. Legal loaves had to meet a minimum weight standard, and woe to the baker who sold a suspiciously light roll it might just get impounded as a fraud against Her Majesty's flour. In some towns, seizing a dishonest loaf was cause for public humiliation, followed by the traditional ceremony of bread shaming. The condemned loaf would be nailed to the bakery door as a warning to others, much like a carbohydrate criminal. It's unclear how effective this actually was, though it did lead to a few pigeons forming early unions. Eventually, these officials faded from prominence as factory-made bread and centralized regulations took the reins. The spoon-wielding champions were replaced by lab technicians and food standards inspectors with significantly less romantic tools. But before the procession of precision-measured gluten charts, there was that fellow in a felt hat dragging his coat through the rain, examining a questionable crust by candlelight, and whispering softly to the dough, "Tell me your secrets." And so we leave him there, this flour-fighting hero of quiet conviction, as the bread begins to rise for new questions, and our story puffs gently onward into the next chapter, where the mills themselves start spinning a darker tale. Chapter 17, of lice, wigs, and the curious case of flour-filled powder. Drift back now with me, dear dreamer, into a parlour made foggy by white dust, not from weather nor furniture neglect, but from a puff of powder applied to a rather prominent wig. Yes, it's the 18th century, and while politics and revolutions may have swirled noisily outside, inside the finer drawing rooms a quieter, fluffier drama was unfolding. Hair powder. Now, what does this have to do with bread? You ask through a yawn. Quite a bit, as it turns out. Because the powdered wigs and coiffures of the well-heeled classes weren't dusted with mere fairy dust. They were often crowned with finely milled wheat flour, scented and tinted, sometimes a rosy lavender, sometimes a ghostly grey, to lend any gentleman or lady the gravitas of a walking pastry. Hair powder was a lucrative and fashionable commodity in the Georgian age, and what better raw material than flour? Already plentiful thanks to Europe's enthusiastic obsession with bread. Unfortunately, powdered flour tends to get everywhere, and in a home where candles flicker and fire roars conscientiously in the hearth, even something as seemingly innocent as airborne flour could transform an evening soiree into an impromptu fireworks display. It's true, flour dust is flammable, a fact that determined bakers have always handled with nervous reverence. But the aristocrats of the 1700s hadn't quite connected the dots. So while one hand daintily held a fan, the other absent-mindedly flicked embers from a pipe, occasionally causing an entire hairdo to become something more flambé. But the threat of ignition wasn't the only peril. The wigs themselves were bastions of confusion. Beneath all the backcombing and powdering, tiny strangers often moved in, lice. In fact, it was so common for powdered wigs to become bustling bug hostels that entire professions bloomed to deal with the problem. Enter the licemonger, a delightful title for a person whose job it was to rid your majestic head muffin of guests it did not invite. Now, if you've ever wondered whether you're living in the wrong century, just imagine hiring someone to delouse your powdered hairpiece while you sip tea and discuss the price of molasses. Comforting, isn't it? Hair powder wasn't solely made from flour. Some inventive minds turned to crushed starches, orris root, even gypsum. Yes, that's a component of drywall. But wheat flour remained a common choice, despite the fact that it attracted not only vermin to your wig stand, but political criticism too. You see, as food scarcity grew more pronounced in certain regions, the intelligentsia and assorted rabble began to ask a pesky question. Why, O powdered elite, Are we dusting our heads with what we need in our stomachs? This culinary coiffure crisis became so economically awkward that in times of grain shortage, flour hair powder was seen as a symbol, not just of wealth, but of waste. Riots weren't unheard of. Wig powdering parties became risky business. In 1795, the issue reached a critical puff. A tax was levied in Britain on hair powder. It was meant to raise funds during the Napoleonic Wars, but it had a side effect. Hundreds of previously powdered nobles went au naturel almost overnight, not purely out of protest, rather to avoid payment. Thus, flaxen locks and untouched curls re-emerged from beneath their dusty disguises. The slogan that followed was surprisingly catchy: a tax on vanity. And as public sentiment wiggled against the use of flour on one's head while others starved, hair powder fell out of vogue like an overbaked soufflé collapsing in reverse. So wheat, that humble, sleep-soft stalk of promise, became both a symbol of sustenance and a canvas of absurdity. It endured ridicule in the name of fashion, flared up when rubbed the wrong way, literally, if near a flame, and gave lice a stage upon which to break dance across noble scalps. It was a time when flour was dangerous not only to your stomach, but also your salon etiquette. And with that powdered thought, let us brush the flour from our brows and tiptoe deeper into history, where the very blight on bread made cities gasp and bakers sweat. Chapter 18. The bakers who faked it best. Nestled between the clatter of clogs on cobblestones and the low hum of early morning fog, 18th century bakeries had more drama than a poorly proofed sourdough. And no, we're not just talking about the unfortunate citizens who kept fainting after nibbling a crusty roll laced with accidental arsenic. Tonight, we explore something more deliberate and slightly more theatrical: the curious art of baking deception. See, once upon a time, people expected their bread not only to feed them, but to not kill them. Reasonable, no, but flour was expensive, and bakers, being human, and therefore terrible at resisting shortcuts, began to engage in all manner of flour-fooling finesse. Ah yes, the stage was set for a quiet but compelling form of performance art: bread fraud. Now, if you were a baker in, say, mid-1700s London, and you wanted to stretch your flour supply just a pinch, you had options. Dubious options, but options nonetheless. You could, for example, blend your lovely, proper wheat flour with something a tad more available, like chalk, or ground bones, or if you were feeling especially ambitious, a smattering of alum, an astringent compound known to whiten the bread, giving it an angelic glow that whispered, "I am pure," even as it plotted gastrointestinal betrayal. Why go through the trouble of adding these flour supplements? Well, because the whiter the bread, the more expensive it looked. White bread was seen as elegant, aristocratic, the kind of thing you'd imagine being served at breakfast to a duke slightly hungover from a masquerade ball. So bakers, especially those catering to the upwardly hopeful, began getting artistic. If you couldn't afford the price of premium wheat, you could fake a posh loaf with a well-measured handful of whitening powder. Health risks aside, and there were many, the illusion often worked. But like all good secret societies, this one had enemies. Chief among them, the Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce. A noble-sounding name, and an equally noble goal: keeping bones out of buns. They began running tests, issuing warnings, and encouraging ordinary citizens to keep an eye out for suspiciously white bread. And it wasn't just a London issue. Over in France, bread was practically a national pastime, and the stakes were even higher. A bad bull could spark unrest, or at least complaints loud enough to reach a bored noble sniffing scented handkerchiefs in Versailles. French bakers, too, danced with deception, though their additions were more flour adjacent. Bits of rice flour, potato starch, and even fermented old dough scraped from yesterday's pans. Not particularly alarming, until a few of those scrapings turned a bit green. In Germany, bread adulteration became something of a national scandal by the late 1700s. Municipal inspectors, known as bread jurors, a title far less glamorous than it sounds, roamed towns nibbling loaves and taking notes. If your bread looked suspiciously soft or suspiciously not like bread, you might find yourself publicly shamed, or fined, or worse, made to read pamphlets comparing your work unfavorably with that of competent bakers from the next town. Yet, in spite of the powdered bones and patriotic shame, most consumers didn't catch on. Why? Because bread, even bad bread, still filled a stomach, and hunger will accept excuses that common sense will not. Still, amid a cloud of powdered alum and moral ambiguity, not all bakers went rogue. Some genuinely tried to do honest work, becoming quiet champions of edible integrity. Others simply didn't know the additives were harmful. The science, you see, was as spotty as a cow in a meadow. Arsenic hadn't quite perfected its reputation yet, and some people thought a little chalk might even be good for you. But before you lose sleep over the misadventures of your powdered predecessors, rest easy knowing this. By the early 19th century, the tide began to turn. Laws were passed, testing improved, and the thought of seasoning your baguette with pulverized skeletons went firmly out of vogue. Still, there was something poetic, in the faintest sense, about the baker's dance between survival and spectacle. They weren't just feeding mouths, they were baking illusions, dangerous illusions, flour-dusted theatre. Now, if your eyes are gently closing like the doors of a well-stocked pantry, you're not alone. Drift onward, dear listener, as we next gently unfurl the tale of a miller's curious invention, a machine that promised to purify flour and change the course of milling forever. Sort of. Chapter 19. The Yeasty Whispers of the Apology Loaf. As twilight deepens over the soot-powdered rooftops of 18th century England, imagine slipping quietly into the back alleyways of a tiny village bakery. The air is warm and fragrant, pulsing with the doughy breath of half-snoozing ovens. Against the creak of ancient boards and the murmurs of fermenting dough, a peculiar tradition is rising, one that uses bread not as sustenance or status, but as an apology. Yes. Welcome to the world of the regret loaf. The custom went something like this. If you wronged your neighbour, perhaps by borrowing their goose and returning it remarkably degoosed, you might show your remorse not with mere words, but with a lovingly baked loaf of contrition. The apology bread. It was never officially codified, but widely understood. You'd arrive at your neighbour's door, hat in hand, flour still clinging to your elbows, bearing a loaf of warm bread, crust cracked just so, steam curling like a peace flag. But beware, the bread had to be edible. In a time when adulterants lurked in flour sacks like wolves in wool, gifting a loaf laced with chalk or alum would only deepen the offence. That was the trouble, you see. When flour itself was treacherous, the peace offering carried the risk of reigniting hostilities with every bite. Imagine it. Thank you for this carbolic-smelling cricket brick, Reginald. My dentist sends his regards. To avoid this, more thoughtful townsfolk paid a premium to the local miller for a sack of clean flour, unblighted by bones, bran, or blue vitriol. Millers, in response, sometimes labelled their bags with poetic names like Angel's White or kiss of Mary, which tended to be comforting until someone discovered the mixture included chalk ground from a former parish altar. Still, the sentiment endured. The loaves themselves were decorated in subtle ways. Some bakers inked initials into the crust with burnt sugar. Others lightly spelt out short apologies in slivered almonds. One deluded romantic in Devon once attempted to bake an entire sonnet into the centre of a rye loaf, only for it to explode mid-bake, sonnet and all, showering the kitchen in yeasty shrapnel and Victorian self-pity. Some apology loaves came with ornate butter dishes shaped like cherubs, others with handwritten notes tucked into hollowed ends, tiny starchy mailboxes of sad confession. "Forgive my pig's trespass into your parsnip patch," one such letter read. He meant only admiration. But there were darker tales too. In 1779, the infamous Lady Hargrave reportedly received a blackened loaf from a rival baroness, half-burned, over-salted, and curiously shaped like a wig. The message? "I'm sorry you're still fashionable." Diplomats took months to repair the damage, and the wig loaf became a minor symbol of passive aggression in high society. Invitations soon bore the postscript. Bread served at dinner is symbolic only. Remarkably, the bread as apology tradition also crossed borders. In rural French villages, a similar custom emerged, though their loaves were round, softer, and often flavoured with lavender. The French, as always, took the practice and made it smell like poetry. Even in the German principalities, certain bakers became known for their Entschuldigungsbrot, the forgiveness bread, tightly packed silent messages nestled beneath caraway seeds and salt. Townsfolk whispered that the better the crust, the more sincere the sorrow. And so, across Europe, bread wore many faces: survival ration, poor man's pillow, poison delivery system, and, here, humble emissary of regret. What a strange thing, isn't it? To risk communicative food in an age when food itself might fell you where you stood. Flour was suspect, yeast could be moody, and yet we humans still knotted our remorse into dough and hoped it would rise with redemption. There's something gently tragic and deeply hopeful about it. Imagine now, as your breath slows, the sigh of a baking hearth. Coals pulse like sleepy fireflies, a pan's soft rattle. Outside, a neighbour opens their door, sees a steaming apology nestled on the step, and smiles. A message written in crust, a quiet olive branch, golden and warm. And just over that sleepy hill of dreams, the next tale beckons, this time of bakers who vanished overnight, leaving only footprints and flour. Chapter 20. The Curious Case of the Crumb Collectors Guild. Let us drift now into a quieter corner of 18th century Europe, where the dust of flour settles not in scandal, but in society. A time when, nestled between mouldy loaves and murmurs of rye-based mischief, a secret brotherhood was born, or, more accurately, a somewhat inefficient and entirely unofficial association known as the Crumb Collectors Guild. Yes, crumb collectors. While illuminators copied manuscripts and apothecaries churned out suspicious potions involving pickled toads, a different breed of tradesperson was quietly springing up in the curling alleyways of towns, just a touch too obsessed with cleanliness. They had one purpose: to collect breadcrumbs from the tables of the wealthy. Not for larceny, not even for leftover soup, but for profit, and a peculiar sense of prestige. In large manor houses where bread crusts were judiciously sliced away, because, as was mysteriously believed, crust was a peasant's burden, the soft innards of bread were often consumed with aplomb, and the excess, those light flaky trails of ancestral gluten, were brushed neatly into ornate silver trays. These trays were then passed along to servants who reportedly funneled them, both literally and figuratively, into the welcoming bags of crumb collectors. Herein lies the truly sleepy oddity. In select cities, Paris, Milan, Vienna, tiny crumb collection guilds sprung up. These were not powerful unions. There were no padded robes or weapons involved, unless you count the bread knives, which were usually quite dull. Members met quietly in flour-dusted basements, wearing austere aprons and holding solemn discussions about crumb width specifications and optimal bread dryness for midwinter collection. Paris's Crumb Collectors Guild, the most famous among them, albeit still completely ignored by 99.9% of society, was reportedly run by a man called Jules the Toast, not named so for charisma, but for an unfortunate accidental baking incident in his youth involving a disgruntled baguette and a chicken coop oven. Jules believed in what he called the sanctity of the leftover, claiming that within the crumb lies both the past and the possibility of poultice. A poetic sentiment, if slightly crumby in rationale. The collected breadcrumbs, far from being hoarded as trophies, actually had a peculiar little market. Mixed with lard and herbs, they became rudimentary stuffing for cheap sausages. Added to weak broth, they helped feign fullness for the poor. In desperate kitchens, breadcrumbs could thicken sauces, hide the taste of turnips, or serve as the base of dishes with beautiful names like pain perdu, literally lost bread, but sounding more like a tragic opera. And in some sleepy corners of Germany, breadcrumb pillows were even rumoured to exist for infants with curious allergies. Hard to confirm, but not outside the realm of lightly toasted possibility. However, as with all cosy things, cranky regulations eventually swept in. Local health boards, which took their roles more seriously than jesters at a funeral, began suspecting that the public recycling of breadcrumbs might, in fact, be unsanitary. The idea of collecting unguarded bread particles from the tables of upper-crust households and stirring them into someone else's supper made a few frowns crease with concern. Thus, the crumb collector began fading, like flour in a gust of wind, from daily life, replaced by more industrialized, suspiciously silent processes involving machines that could never appreciate the beauty of a solitary crouton. Still, somewhere in the gentle drift of dust along old bakery shelves, you can imagine them, the last crumb collectors with their careful brushes and linen sacks, tiptoeing through noble dining halls in search of that one last golden fleck of brioche. And so, as the whispers of guilds and breadcrumbs fade into the coziness of distant memory, let us wander further into the peculiar world of edible illusion. For soon, we will arrive at the tale of bread so glossy, so falsely golden, it might have belonged in a jewelry case instead of a kitchen. Chapter 21. The Curious Case of the Cat in the Mill. Some stories from the dusty corners of history arrive at our sleepy ears, not with grand salutes or trumpet blasts, but with a quiet, whiskered sneeze and a gentle thud from a grain sack above. This is one of those stories. Let us drift now to a sleepy flour mill, tucked somewhere in the English countryside, perhaps Kent, or maybe Sussex, where the air is thick with chalky dust and the breeze smells faintly of yeast, sawdust and cats. Yes, cats. In the 18th century, flour mills were not only the grain-grinding hearts of the entire villages, but also, unexpectedly, full-time boarding houses for felines. Their rent, unofficial pest control. Their hobbies, lounging on warm burlap sacks and occasionally knocking a candle into someone's foot bath. One particular cat, whom we will call Marmalade for the sake of historical colour, was known throughout his mill for his impressive whiskers and unrelenting sense of justice. Marmalade was a tabby of dignified temperament, known to stare unblinkingly at suspicious sacks as if interrogating them into confession. He strutted between grinding stones, utterly unfazed by the persistent vibration of wooden floorboards, and once napped for 8 hours beneath a hopper without so much as a sneeze. Marmalade was part of a silent but vital force in the war against contamination. You see, while soils and wheats had their own invisible dangers, ergot fungus, we remember you unfondly. Nothing disrupted a baker's dreams faster than the scurrying of mice. Where grain went, rodents followed like unpaid auditors. Left unchecked, they chewed holes through sacks, nibbled on flour stalks, and once, in Stirling, Scotland, attempted to form a tiny revolutionary collective demanding equal wheat for tails and teeth. While cats never truly embraced payroll, their contributions were significant. Millers, often weary men with flour in their ears and splinters in their beards, treated their cats with a mix of reverence and resignation. One anonymous miller, scribbling in a journal too flour-streaked to read clearly, once noted that his cat had more common sense than most apprentices and fewer fleas. But let us not mistake the mill cat life for glamour. Between the clanking of gears, the moaning of wood under constant movement, and the soul-stirring rhythm of the millstones, it all resembled a very loud lullaby played in a minor key. At night, the mill creaked like a ship on a sea of grain. And Marmalade, he would patrol the beams above, eyes glowing faintly in the lantern light, like a tiny guardian of the gluten realm. Yet not all dangers came squeaking. The very dust their paws walked through, the endless powdery flour, was as volatile as it was necessary. One careless strike of iron against stone could send an airborne puff, igniting like something from a magician's warm-up act. It is a peculiar irony of history that the same substance one lovingly kneads into a croissant could also, on a bad day, attempt to remove the roof entirely. Mill cats, however, remained oblivious to notions of combustion. Marmalade once sat majestically in the exact center of a minor flour explosion, completely unharmed and slightly disappointed that the event didn't include fish. In the aftermath, as the millers coughed and counted fingers, Marmalade merely resumed his nap, tail curling like an earthen scroll. It is said, by a miller's grandson, admittedly, that Marmalade eventually retired to live with a widowed baker who made him warm milk every morning and told tales of brave biscuits and haunted ovens. Whether or not this is true hardly matters. In the soft, flour-scented corners of forgotten ledgers and the scribbled margins of shipping slips, cats like Marmalade were the unthanked sentinels of the bread world. So the next time you see a cat blink languidly from a bakery window or stretch along a sunlit windowsill, remember Marmalade, and how, even in the dustiest corners of danger, one noble tabby kept lots and lots of bread just a tiny bit safer. Now, as we close the shutters on this feline footnote, let us move quietly onward toward a late-night ritual, oddly spirited and only occasionally flammable. Chapter 22. The Worm in the Loaf. When farmers knew more than scientists. In the rustling fields of 18th century Europe, where golden wheat bowing in the breeze was a common scene, there lived a peculiar paradox. Farmers, those sun-wrinkled sages in muddy boots, often knew far more about bread safety than the doctors in powdered wigs. And as we drift deeper into this flour-dusted tale, we arrive at a rather important turning point, when people began to suspect quietly that maybe their grain was making them a little too dramatic. And by dramatic, of course, we mean convulsing in the town square or believing they were hunted by invisible beasts. You see, by the 1770s, villagers had started whispering odd things. Uncle Silas had taken to speaking in Latin no one taught him. Mildred swore the walls were melting, and young Thomas claimed angels told him to eat only duckweed, at breakfast no less. Now, the educated men of the day, the clergy, the physicians with their leech jars, the oddly high percentage of local barbers moonlighting as surgeons, all generally agreed it was demonic possession, excessive theology, or perhaps too much time spent thinking. But the farmers, they pointed to the harvest and said, quite plainly, that rye's gone bad. Indeed, rye was playing tricks on people. The culprit, as we've teased in earlier whispers around this dreamy fireside of history, was ergot, a fungus that grew on damp grain and bore a suspicious resemblance to blackened rice, or perhaps little soot-covered sausages stuck on stalks. But back then, nobody called it ergot. They called it the Black Evil, St. Anthony's Fire, or, in some frustrated baker's terms, that blasted bread rot. And here is where it gets charmingly frustrating. The people who most often recognized the signs of ruined grain were not those with university degrees, but those with hay in their hair. Farmers, especially older ones, had rules of thumb passed down from medieval grandmothers with uncanny instincts. Some families claimed that if the hens avoided the grain, so should the humans. Others said, if your rye feels moist and smells like wet shoes, don't mill it. A good rule then and now. But management of grain was no small affair, especially during years of damp harvests and tight coin purses. Grain merchants, motivated more by price than purity, often mixed good grain with suspect rye. And when someone fell ill, and by ill we mean having full-blown hallucinations after a sandwich, the blame was as foggy as the mornings in Burgundy. Meanwhile, in sleepy labs and musty universities, scholars tried desperately to catch up with what farmers intuited. One French physician, whose name history has kindly forgotten, insisted that the convulsions were caused by shame over improper moral choices. He had a whole lecture about the dangers of secretly coveting your neighbor's goat. But in contrast to these lofty theories and theological chest thumping, an old farmer named Benoit near Limoges reportedly said, "Put the rye in a jar. If it grows fuzz, don't eat it." 300 years later, modern mycology agrees. Benoit, 1. Doctors, nil. But perhaps the most touching part of this dusty tale is that families protected each other in quiet, practical ways. Mothers would test bread by nibbling the edge before feeding it to children. Some towns developed rituals around sieving flour or storing grain with certain herbs believed to fight spoilage, like lavender or bay leaves. Whether or not these worked chemically is up for debate. But there's something tender about it, isn't there? A kind of folklore medicine ballet danced in hand-woven aprons. Even some village bakers developed ways to test flour by smell, texture, and pattern of rise. Bread that puffed unevenly could be suspect. Loaves with overly dark crusts might signal deeper trouble. And if your neighbor's loaf produced a 3-day jazz recital in their kitchen, best to skip borrowing a slice. As we drift, softly now, down the flowery lane of history, we see it clearly. Knowledge doesn't always wear robes or scribble Latin on parchment. Sometimes it wears straw hats and smells faintly of onions. Sometimes the clearest wisdom comes not from books, but from breadcrumbs. And as the twilight settles gently over another field of nodding grain, let us lay our heads on this thought. Even in chaotic times, when bread could whisper nightmares, there were those who quietly diligently and stubbornly insisted on keeping the loaf and the family safe. In the cage, next hush of history, we'll follow the curious case of a bakery so feared by its own town that delivery came with a warning bell and a prayer. But for now, let your thoughts fall like chaff in the breeze, light, slow, and ready for dreams. Chapter 23. Of spoons, soot, and scientific scandals, the curious rise of chemists in the kitchen. By now, our meandering tale of deadly bread and risky rolls has kneaded its way through the shadowy ovens of 18th century deceit. But tonight, we tiptoe into the quieter chambers of knowledge, where the air smells faintly of ink, microscope oil, and maybe just a pinch of sulfur. A time when chemistry, like a keen-eyed grandparent, began peeking into flour sacks and asking, what exactly are we putting in our muffins? Let's begin with utmost gentleness in a rather modest laboratory, the kind with high windows, dusty corners, and the sound of occasional bubbling. Think less Frankenstein and more tea gone slightly too long on the stove. Here, a small cadre of curious minds began questioning what the millers and bakers had been up to. You see, powdered bones and alum were not traditional baking spices, yet there they were, tangled into the dough of the common loaf. Some additions were meant to whiten the bread. Vanity, even then, did not sleep, while others disguised the use of inferior flour, chalk to soften texture, pipes of lead to press dough just so. Nothing adds that extra je ne sais quoi like trace elements and a hearty dose of heavy metals. But around the mid-1700s, in the warm glow of Enlightenment thought and the sputtering lanterns of public dissatisfaction, a few figures rose from the fog with an almost revolutionary idea. Let's test what's in the bread before we eat it. Enter Frederick Ackham, the chemist with a flair for drama and public service. Granted, he's a little more 19th century than 18th, but think of him as a sleepy dawn, heralding the full sunrise of consumer safety. Ackham peered into bread and beer, famously writing, "A treatise on adulterations of food and culinary poisons." Not exactly a beach read, but wonderfully informative if you enjoy knowing when your breakfast might kill you. He didn't shy away from naming names either. A sort of chemical detective meets Food Network judge, accusing millers and merchants with the flair of a Shakespearean ghost. Thou art corrupted by gypsum, and thy pastry reeks of mischief. But our chapter isn't just about Ackham. Oh no. This was an era of enthusiastic experimentation, a time when people were fairly sure they could figure out anything if they prodded it enough with a burnt spoon. Chemists sliced up loaves, stirred flour with acids, and even devised color tests to reveal hidden alum. If your bread frothed like a startled cappuccino, perhaps you had more than yeast inside. Imagine aspiring scientists sitting by candlelight, breadcrumbs on their waistcoats, muttering softly as they tried to identify unpronounceable substances by both taste and sniff. No gloves, no standards, half the time no idea. It was a chaotic ballet of curiosity. And yet, gradually, method emerged from the mess. Patterns took shape. Truths, hidden like raisins in a pudding, began surfacing under the scrape of a polished spoon. The most charming detail, perhaps, is their sincerity. Many of these early food chemists were racked by both fascination and moral duty. They weren't just performing experiments. They were advocating in posh pamphlets and dingy courtrooms alike. A good chemist could smell chalk in bread at 20 paces and shout about it in Latin. And slowly, wonderfully slowly, the public began to listen. Or at least, a significant slice of it. Bread became a subject of scientific inspection as much as daily digestion. Newspapers printed alarming tales of poison pastries. Parlours buzzed with chatter about alum, like a strange mid-century gossip. Of course, not everyone appreciated the intrusion. Bakers accused chemists of fear-mongering. Parliament grumbled at the suggestion of regulation. After all, if a man couldn't add a bit of whitening powder to thin flour, was this even England? But the seed had been planted. Once the art of food tinkering had turned into something more noble, science intertwined with sanctity, there was, quite simply, no unbaking it. And so, as the lamplight flickers low and chemists fold their parchment notes with flour-dusted fingers, the world dozes deeper, with dreams sweetened by a rare and precious thing: progress. Measured not in grand revolutions, but in steadily rising dough, free at last from the ghosts of arsenic and chalk. In the hush of history's kitchen, another truth gently rises beneath the proofing cloth. When science enters the pantry, mystery loses its appetite. And with that, in the soft silence of cooling ovens, we'll drift to our final chapter, where justice at last is served, perhaps even warm, with butter. Chapter 24, The Last Crumb Before Dreams. And so, dear listener, our journey through the crusty, crumb-laden corridors of dangerous 18th century bread brings us here, to the final flowery curtain call. The oven has cooled, the loaves are still, the yeast has risen, fallen, and politely gone to bed. But before you drift into your own soft pillow of slumber, let's sit for one last moment at the fireside of history, where the embers glow orange, the air smells faintly of rye and ash, and a rather flat-looking loaf rests beside us, as if exhausted by the centuries it has survived. Now, bread wasn't always the humble background player it seems today, squished between cold cuts or used to mop up soup. No, in the 1700s, it was power, politics, and occasionally a mild biohazard. You could rise or fall by your baguette. Civil unrest stirred when flour prices soared, and housewives knew the difference between a baker with integrity and one who snuck alum and chalk into his dough with a grin and no conscience whatsoever. By our final decade, the twilight years of the 18th century, bread was no longer just food, it was legislation. In Britain, Parliament passed laws regulating loaf prices with all the solemnity of a royal wedding. There was the assize of bread, a regulation that essentially said, if you charge a tuppence for a loaf, it had better weigh what a small dog does. And if not, well, expect a fine, public shame, or worse. Angry mobs armed not with pitchforks, but yesterday's stale buns. In Paris, the situation was more baguette-shaped and revolution-flavoured. Let's not forget that in 1789, French citizens weren't storming the Bastille for romantic ideals alone. They were hungry. They couldn't afford bread. And when Marie Antoinette allegedly chirped, "Let them eat cake," a quote she very likely never said, it revealed something deeper than political disconnect. It showed how bread had become a symbol of inequality, of a crust split too unevenly. Of course, you might ask, could all of this have been different had they only discovered sourdough earlier? But alas, fermentation moves at its own sleepy pace. As 1800 approached, and George Washington hung up his tri-cornered hat for the last time, flour production was finally being eyed with suspicion as well as reverence. Scientists, usually awkward men in powdered wigs and impatient waistcoats, began to seriously study what on earth was going into people's bread. Out went the chalk dust, the sawdust, the powdered bones, and the substances unfit even for pigeons. In came early food inspectors who, bless their earnest souls, would peer at a wheat sack and mutter, Not crunchy enough for granite. Perhaps this is real flour. Millstones were gradually replaced with cleaner, more consistent rolling machines. Public bakeries began posting the ingredients they used. May as well be proud if your croissants don't glow in the dark. And a strange thing began to happen. Bread, once feared and fought over, began to trust us again. It began to settle, to become, at long last, boring in the best possible way. And isn't that a kind of victory? For all the poisoned loaves, the blanched bones, the adulterated crusts, and vengeful muffins, we found our way to breads we could generally eat without incident. No risk of hallucinations, no lead filings between the ciabatta. Just a quiet slice of toast waving from the breakfast table saying, "We've come a long way, haven't we?" And now, the bakery shutters close. The dreamscape grows quiet. Only the soft whisper of flour floating lazily in the moonlight remains. You've wandered through fields of barley, danced in old French boulangeries, and ducked from Georgian-era muffins with suspicious glazes. Now it's time to fold away the dough of stories and tuck yourself in like a warm roll awaiting a gentle rise. May your dreams be light, your thoughts unsifted, and your worries, like yesterday's crumbs, swept away. Good night, sweet sleeper of history, and may the bread be ever in your favor.